Welcome. Tonight, we are not simply telling history. We are stepping into it quietly, without footsteps, without force, like entering a warm room lit only by oil lamps. This isn't the kind of story that begins with kings and conquests, nor with great discoveries or battles long forgotten. No, this begins where most things truly begin, at the edges of rivers, in the folds of dust, and in the stillness between stars, where people moved not in haste, but in harmony with the land beneath their feet and the sky above their heads. We won't be shouting across time, a place where silence had shape, and slowness was not a burden, but a gift. That place is Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, the soft sweep of a priest's robe over stone steps, the flicker of firelight across a mud-brick wall. Let your thoughts loosen. These are the echoes of a world that once was, and in many ways still is, quiet, eternal, waiting just beyond the veil of modern noise, the cradle of civilization, and tonight it will cradle you. There is a place where time didn't tick, but flowed, not forward, not backward, just around. We won't be rushing through empires. Instead, we will settle into the spaces most histories leave behind, the rhythm of daily life, the shape of a potter's hand on clay. As you listen, let your breath slow. Let the ancient wind pass through you, soft and dry like reeds brushing along a canal, told not in urgency, but in rest. There are no demands here, no alarms to wake you, just a story older than steel or stone. This is not the Mesopotamia of textbooks, the eternal gaze of gods carved in clay. It is not facts and figures. It is feeling, the feeling of morning dust beneath bare feet, the hush of twilight over barley fields, the knowing glance between a mother and child. And so, with nothing left to do, and nowhere you need to be, we begin. Not at the beginning of history, but in the middle of a single, ordinary day. In the city of yore, when the first civilization rose, not with thunder, but with sleep. Before the world knew time as numbers, before alarms began our days and schedules dictated our nights, there was the silence of sunrise over yore. The city stirred not with noise, but with warmth, a slow awakening of clay and dust beneath a copper sky. Smoke drifted from the holes in rooftop kitchens, rising in lazy spirals as if reluctant to let go of the night. Homes built from sun-baked mud brick glowed faintly in the early light, their rough textures catching the sun like memory holds breath. No one shouted, no one hurried. Dawn was not a beginning, was a continuation, like the soft turning of a wheel that never stops. Outside the rounded doorways of the homes, the earth was already warm. Between reed fences and stone paths, a dog stretched and yawned, its ears flicking lazily. In one quiet lane, a woman wrapped in linen stepped barefoot onto the dirt, her basket resting easily against her hip. Behind her, her children still slept on woven mats, curled like kittens in the shade. Her steps made no sound as she moved toward the well, where clay jars stood in a small cluster, waiting to be filled with the morning's first gift. Far beyond the Mesopotamian homes, the ziggurat stood like a sleeping giant. Its stone steps reached skyward in solemn tiers, casting long shadows over the waking city. At its base, a few white-robed priests passed silently, their heads bowed, their feet bare against the cool stone. They moved like time itself measured, undisturbed. Above them, near the summit, a lone figure stood still, watching the sky where stars faded slowly into the pale blue of day. He did not speak. He only watched, eyes searching the heavens for signs written not in words, but in the alignment of distant lights. Down at the canals, the fields were already breathing. Water moved through the hand-cut channels with a sound like whispering silk, feeding rows of barley that swayed gently in the breeze. A father and son knelt at the edge of the irrigation trench, tying a plumb stone to a frayed reed string. The man's hands were thick with calluses, his movements careful and slow. The boy watched without blinking. His father spoke only once. "This stone," he said, "kept your grandfather's rows straight. It listens to gravity." The boy didn't reply. He didn't need to. The stillness between them said enough. As the morning wore on, the city came alive not with clamor, but with rhythm. In shaded courtyards, bakers pressed dough flat on sun-warmed stones. Women stirred pots with long-handled ladles, the scent of garlic and cracked lentils rising softly into the air. From a windowless room, The sharp tap of a chisel marked the beginning of a clay tablet, another record for another transaction, shaped by hands that had learned the weight of language without letters. Life was not hurried here. It was traced, pressed, carved, sung. In one corner of the village, the potter worked beneath a cloth canopy stretched between two walls. His wheel turned slowly, smooth and steady, the clay rising beneath his palms, as if it remembered what it wanted to become. A bowl, perhaps, or a jar for storing grain. His daughter sat nearby, threading cord through a fishing net, her bare feet tucked beneath her. They didn't speak. The sound of spinning clay was its own music, and the silence between them was full. By midday, the heat pressed low over the rooftops. Shadows clung to the walls like resting birds. In a quiet home, a boy practiced cuneiform under the watch of a patient scribe, tracing each wedge into the wet clay with his reed stylus. The Mesopotamian room was cool and dim, lit only by a shaft of light filtering through a high window. The boy's tongue poked from the corner of his mouth in concentration. Each mark was a memory being born. Outside, a goat bleated once and was silent again. Elders gathered beneath a fig tree, their hands wrapped loosely around carved staffs. Their eyes half. They spoke in slow turns, trading stories like coin stelaes of floods and kings, of cities swallowed by sand. Their voices were low and dusty, not meant to teach, only to echo. One man leaned back against the tree trunk and smiled faintly as he told a story about a god who drank too much beer and slept for 3 days beneath a mountain. No one laughed. They'd heard it before. That was the point. The afternoon softened into evening. The color of the dust deepened from beige to rose. Mesopotamian children splashed in shallow basins. The call of a vendor selling onions floated down the alley, answered by the rustle of fabric as women leaned from rooftops to listen. The potter's wheel stilled. The last batch of bread was pulled from the coals. The scribe laid down his stylus and rubbed his eyes. And the ziggurat, that ancient, silent witness, cast its final shadow across the face of the Mesopotamian city. Night didn't fall here. It drifted. The oil lamps were lit one by one, their flames flickering softly behind pottery screens. Inside the homes, families shared bowls of stew and folded their legs beneath them. A mother sang a song without melody. A child yawned into her hands. Outside, under the stars, the priest lit the last of the temple incense and whispered a prayer to all for translation. Above him, the moon had begun its slow climb, full and pale as a sleeping god, and in the deepest hours of the night, you'll return to its breath. The wind curled around corners. The barley fields shimmered under the stars. The city slept not because it was tired, but because it had always known how. It had learned to live in rhythm, not in resistance. In silence, not in sound. In waiting, not in wanting. And somewhere, far beyond the rooftops, the two rivers flowed on, as they always had, as they always would. As the quiet rhythm of the city carried on grain bread baked, stories whispered in shaded courtyards, one figure moved differently through the day. His hands did not press clay, nor pull water from canals. He spoke little, worked less, but the weight he carried was older than stone. While others toiled beneath the sun, he watched the stars. And while the city slept beneath the glow of oil lamps, he climbed. For in every city there are those who listen not to voices, but to silence. And in ancient yore there was one such man, the high priest, the dreamer, the one who stood at the edge of heaven and waited. The Mesopotamian he rose long before the sun, before the birds called from the reed beds, before even the river's voice was awake. The city was still blanketed in the hush of night, and yet he moved with purpose, measured steps across stone, each footfall soft as a falling leaf. In the heart of yore, the high priest wrapped himself in linen, its folds brushed with ash and ground lapis. Not for ornament, for alignment, he bore no crown, no jewels, only silence, and a mind trained to listen, not to men, but to the sky. His name had been given at birth, but few spoke it now. Among the temple walls, he was simply the voice, not because he spoke often, but because when he did, it was not his words they heard, but something older, something that smelled of incense and river mud. His fingers bore the faint stains of cuneiform ink, and his eyes, dark, distant, rimmed by sleep, held stories no one had ever written down. Each morning, Before the first smoke curled from cooking fires, he climbed the ziggurat stairs, 104 steps, carved with reverence, worn smooth by generations of priests who had walked before him, asking the same questions to the same silent sky. He never counted the steps. He didn't need to. The climb itself was a ritual, a conversation between his body and the god's one breath, one foot, one thought at a time. At the summit, where the air felt thinner and the sounds of the city faded into wind, he waited, not for answers, those rarely came, but for patterns, for signs, for the subtle tilt of a star where it shouldn't be, or the flicker of a planet too close to another. He had spent most of his life learning how to see what others overlooked. A shift in the heavens could mean a poor harvest, or a war, or nothing at all. But he watched anyway, as if the gods had once whispered to him in a dream, and he was still trying to remember what they said. He kept records, of course, scratched into tablets that lined the temple's inner chamber. Rows and rows of sky maps and predictions, but it wasn't the writing that mattered. It was the waiting, the discipline of patience, the willingness to ask questions the stars would never answer. And in that waiting, he found peace. A peace made not of comfort, but of clarity. Not all truths had to be spoken. Some could simply be held. When the sun finally rose, he turned to face it, not with worship, but with recognition. The beginning of day was not his end, but merely another rhythm to join. He descended slowly, the linen of his robe whispering along the stone. Below, the city stirred. Merchants began to lift their baskets. Bakers checked their fires. Children chased each other past temple walls, unaware that above them, the universe had been consulted before their games began. In the shadowed halls of the temple, he performed the rites. The oil was poured, the incense lit, the bowl of dates placed carefully at the base of the shrine. Every action was deliberate, slow, and full of memory. He spoke the ancient names, Enlil, Nana, Inanna, not loudly, but as if he feared disturbing them, or perhaps as if they were already present, listening closely from behind the carved walls. Sometimes, at midday, when the heat made the world still and the air shimmered like a veil, he would sit in the cool chamber behind the altar and sleep, not deeply, but long enough to dream. In these dreams, he never spoke. He only walked through desert winds, along black rivers, beneath stars that pulsed like slow heartbeats. Once, years ago, he dreamt that the gods were asleep, and it was the priests who watched over them, not the other way around. As the day waned and the light grew long and golden across the walls, he made his final ascent. Not for ritual this time, but for breath, for solitude. He stood once more at the edge of the platform, robes still, hands open at his sides. Below, the city exhaled oxen, returning to their pens, fires being lit, prayers being whispered over pots of lentils, and above, the stars began to return, one by one, quiet, as always. He looked up not with hope, not with fear, but with the quiet reverence of someone who had spent his entire life watching a sky that never once spoke back, but had still somehow taught him everything he needed to know. And so, he watched, not for signs of war or rain, but for the subtle language only the stars could speak. He lived not in the noise of the world, but in the space between moments, between prayer and silence, between movement and meaning. But even he, with all his training, could only guess at the gods' intentions. For in this land of dust and grain, there were stories whispered long before cities were built, tales etched in memory, not stirred, of gods who loved and punished, who walked among men in silence, who built the world and then turned away from it. These were not bedtime stories. They were myths soaked into the soil, old as the rivers and just as patient. Long before writing was carved into clay, before the ziggurat ever reached toward the sky, there were only the stories, passed in breath, preserved not on tablets, but in tone low and slow, murmured beside fires, or while kneeling by the river's edge. These were not stories meant to teach or entertain. They were lived, felt, whispered in the pauses between chores, braided into lullabies, or hummed in the silence of waiting rooms carved from mud and shadow. The people of yore did not believe in gods the way we speak of belief. To them, divinity was not distant. The gods were not above the world, they were in it. Enki, god of water, flowed in the canals they carved. Inanna, fierce and radiant, danced in the thunderheads that rolled across the plain. Utu rode the sun's chariot over the barley fields, while Ninhursag watched from the mountains, silent and unmoving. They did not demand worship in song, they demanded rhythm, balance, presence. There was no need to ask whether the gods were real. Their power was in the flood that erased a year's harvest, in the cracked earth that denied water, in the birth of a child, in the stillness of a corpse. They were truth itself, too large to look at directly. And so the people told stories not to explain, but to make peace with what they already knew. One such tale was told again and again, often with only the flicker of an oil lamp to guide it. In the beginning, the gods created humans not from divine spark or celestial light, but from clay, wet earth, mixed with the tears of a weeping god. The humans were fashioned not as children, but as servants, meant to till the fields of the divine, to carry their burdens, to praise them in temples when their names grew heavy from silence. And so life began not in freedom, but in labor, sacred, sacred labor. But not all gods agreed. Inanna, goddess of love, war, and chaos, grew restless. She walked among men in disguise, they said, testing their devotion, measuring the weight of their hearts. Some she blessed with fertility, others she abandoned mid-harvest. She was not cruel, she was balance. They spoke too of the underworld, not a place of punishment, but of forgetting, ruled by Erish Kagil, the shadow sister of Inanna. It was a domain of dust and silence. When someone died, they did not ascend, they descended. Their names were whispered to the ground. Their spirits wandered the halls beneath the earth, neither joyful nor cursed, only still. And then there was the flood, not as punishment, but as reset. The gods, wearied by the clamor of mankind, by the noise, the fires, the endless prayers, sent rain to erase the slate. The water rose, calmly, endlessly, swallowing cities, homes, and stories. But one man, Ziusudra, was warned. He built a great boat, took with him seed, animals, and songs, and when the water receded, he stepped onto dry earth once more. The first words spoken after the flood, they said, were a prayer of gratitude whispered not to a god, but to the soil beneath his feet. These myths were not entertainment. They were maps, guides to a life where no one was truly alone. If the barley failed, it was because Enlil turned his face. If a child was born in silence, it was Nanna's sorrow. And when a priest walked the temple steps in the dark, he did not climb to be heard, he climbed to remind the gods that they were still remembered. But over time, even the priests began to wonder. The gods no longer spoke in visions or signs. Their symbols faded from walls. Their temples, once heavy with incense, became echo chambers. Still, the people continued. Offerings were left. Stories were told. The names were whispered. And perhaps that was all the gods had ever asked for. Not fear, not praise, but presence. To be remembered, to be waited for. And though the names of the gods were whispered for generations, though smoke rose and stories flowed like the rivers, eventually even the prayers grew quiet. Time passed, like wind passing through reeds, and the temple stood alone beneath. The stars they once watched so closely, the cities faded, the stories crumbled, but the earth remembered. Beneath the sand, beneath the silence, the past waited. And one day, centuries later, hands returned not to pray, but to uncover. The desert was quiet, not the silence of emptiness, but of memory. A silence thick with presence, like something had exhaled a long time ago. And the breath still lingered. A group of men stood at the edge of an open pit, the sun behind them casting long shadows into the hollow. Below, the earth had been carefully scraped away layer by layer, inch by inch. There were no machines here, only brushes, wooden tools, fingertips trained to feel the difference between sand and story. And silence, always silence. They had come searching for ruins, but what they found was something stranger, shape in the dust, the corner of a wall, a jar half buried, sealed for 2,000 years, the tip of a reed stylus, the faint impression of a footprint hardened in clay. Nothing grand, nothing gleaming, but everything important. Beneath the heat, beneath the wind, beneath centuries of forgetfulness, a city had waited. Not a city of gold or war or myth, but of life, of daily routines, of scribes and merchants, of priests and bread makers and children chasing goats. And now, in the soft hush of careful excavation, it was beginning to breathe again. The archaeologists did not rush. They worked like priests themselves, kneeling, bowing, brushing, offering. The sand gave back slowly. A broken tablet here, a polished spindle there. The base of a column that once held up a ceiling now lost a sky. One fragment at a time. The shape of your re-emergent imagined. Not reconstructed, but real, ancient, grounded, in one chamber. Barely wider than a doorway, they found a collection of tablets laid in careful stacks. Administrative records, prayers, inventories of offerings, names. These weren't tales of gods or kings, they were lists of sheep, tallies of bread, receipts, but they mattered, because they proved something most stories forget, that history is built not by heroes, but by hands. Later, beneath a collapsed archway, they uncovered a statue, just the torso. The face was gone, worn smooth by time, but the hands remained folded in front, still in prayer, carved from stone, shaped by someone long vanished, yet still whispering something only silence could understand. The archaeologists stood there for a long time, saying nothing. Sometimes, when the wind shifted, they could hear it, the soft rattle of loose grains of sand skimming across old stone. It sounded like breath, or a voice, or maybe nothing at all. But they listened anyway, because in a place this old, even silence had weight. As the sun began to set, casting long gold across the excavation site, the city glowed softly under the dust. Walls became shadows. Shadows became memory, and the past, half revealed, seemed to exhale again. Not everything would be found, not every story would return. But here, beneath the sand, a few secrets had opened their eyes, and looked back. Some stories rise from the earth in fragments, broken bowls, faded carvings, walls that once held warmth. But beneath those ruins lies something deeper than stone, the quiet difference between those who ruled and those who obeyed. A world split not by war, but by rhythm. Two lives unfolding under the same sun, one behind the high walls of palaces, the other barefoot in dust, but each human. The palace walls rose high above the streets, smooth-faced and pale in the morning sun, their surface kissed by the faint shimmer of crushed gypsum and lime. Inside, time moved differently. The air was cooler, scented not with ash and sweat, but with pressed flowers and cedar oil carried from distant mountains. Here, the day began not with labor, but with listening. A woman reclined on woven cushions, her hair threaded with beads of lapis and gold. Her handmaidens fanned the air gently, whispering the schedule for the Dayan offering at the temple. A visit from a neighboring merchant's wife, a new silk garment to be fitted. She barely responded. Her thoughts were elsewhere, on the dream she had woken from, the one where lions walked through her garden and said nothing. In the corner, a musician played a soft, droning tune on a stringed lyre. The sound filled the room like light through gauze, never sharp, always settling. Even the shadows here felt refined, shaped by the drapes and the slow turn of carved wooden fans. In the palace kitchen, the cooks prepared breakfast: figs preserved in honey, goat's cheese with mint, and barley cakes baked on hot stones. Their hands moved with precision, their voices hushed, not out of fear, but habit. In the service of luxury, silence was the highest currency. Meanwhile, beyond the outer gate, a different morning had begun. A boy crouched beside a clay cistern, filling water jugs for his family. His hands were already cracked, his nails dark with soil. His father had gone before sunrise to repair a collapsed irrigation ditch, and his mother was already kneading dough with salt from the market. Their home was a single room, lit by a hole in the wall and warmed by the presence of one another. Their meals were simple: lentils, onions, and whatever scraps could be traded from the temple kitchens. Yet here, too, there was laughter. The boy's little sister played with a goat's horn she had found in the alley. She imagined it was a crown, and for a moment, just one, she was a queen. She raised her arms and declared herself Inanna, reborn. The neighbors clapped softly, and then went back to chopping onions. Even in the poorest homes, pride lingered. There were walls adorned with painted symbols, charms hung to ward off sickness, and old songs sung while pounding flax. They knew hardship, yes, but also beauty, hidden in the patterns of their clay floors. The smoke of sweetgrass hung in doorways, the way the last piece of bread was always shared. And between these two worlds, palace and alley, silk and dust, there were others, the temple scribes, wrapped in clean linen, who walked through both realms, recording births and deaths and blessings. The midwives, summoned to both gold-covered beds and reed-woven mats. the traders who knelt before kings and then drank with farmers under the same moon. It was not just a society, it was a pulse, a web of lives moving at different paces, in different lights, but all beneath the same stars. No one was ever truly free, not the servant girl who scrubbed the palace floors, nor the royal daughter whose husband had been chosen by her father's priest. But no one was truly forgotten either. In one quiet corner of the city, a craftsman carved a scene onto a clay panel. It showed a queen pouring water for a child. No inscriptions, no names, just the gesture, the hands, the story. In this land, memory was rarely carved into stone for glory, but for truth. A truth that still lingers in every buried bowl and broken wall. That even in a divided world, all lives leave a mark. And sometimes, a servant's touch lasts longer than a king's decree. Long before the walls of cities rose, long before the stars were mapped or gods were named, there were women who knew how to bring life into the world, and how to ease it out again. They were not warriors. They were not scribes or priests, but they carried a knowledge older than writing, older than kings, a knowledge whispered from one hand to another, from womb to womb. In the quiet quarters of Mesopotamia, beneath reed roofs and behind curtains, woven from flax, there lived the midwives. They were called on in moments no one else dared to enter, moments thick with sweat, pain, and blood, but also with miracles. When the first cry of labor echoed through the home, it was not the priest who came, nor the physician. It was her, a woman in a dark robe, a pouch of herbs on her belt, oil on her hands, and silence in her eyes. She needed no scrolls, no tools. She carried everything in her fingers. She knew how to feel the shape of the belly, the turn of the child. She knew how to press here, breathe there, wait a little longer. Her breath slowed the mother's fear. Her voice softened the room. Her hands, weathered and warm, knew when to wait and when to act. She had seen birth 100 times, and death, too. Sometimes both, in the same hour. But she never hardened. She simply watched, and held, and whispered. Sometimes she spoke to the unborn child, not loudly, just enough for the world to hear. She told it the name it would be given. She promised it light, and warmth, and bread. If the child was born into silence, she said no words. She closed the eyes gently, wrapped the body in cloth, lit a small flame, and stayed until the flame went out. And then, she walked home. In Mesopotamia, midwives were more than birth guides. They were healers too. When a child was fevered, it was she who crushed the roots, mixed the poultice, cooled the brow. When a mother bled too long, it was she who held her hand and sang the old song passed down through generations. No temples were built in their honor, no statues carved. But if you asked the people who truly shaped the world, they would tell you it was the ones who stayed during the hardest hours. She also knew the names of herbs not spoken aloud. Juniper for fever, myrrh for swelling, a mixture of fig and honey to coat the throat of a child who could not cry, and prayers, soft ones spoken over jars of goat's milk placed by the door to ward off the dead. Some said she could speak to spirits. Others said she had no need to, that her presence alone was enough to remind life where to go and when to leave. She never called herself wise, but others did. Sometimes she walked past the palace, and even the guards nodded, for they, too, had entered the world through pain in her hands. There were nights when she stayed in the home long after the child was born. She sat beside the new mother and rubbed her feet with warm oil. She whispered stories about stars. She told of how each soul comes through a gate, and how each birth is a kind of remembering, not just for the child, but for the world. And when she finally left, always at night, she walked without fear. The moon lit her path. The city made room. She never hurried. She never stumbled. The wind shifted for her. The dogs did not bark, and somewhere in the distance, the river slowed its sound, as if to honor her passing. You won't find her name written down, but if you listen, you'll hear her in the rhythm of sleep, in the hush before dawn, in the way pain folds into peace, and breath becomes steady again. For she is the keeper of first cries, and last ones, too. She is the midwife of time. And so, the midwife gathered her pouch, tied her shawl, and stepped once more into the quiet streets. The newborn rested beside its mother. The oil lamp flickered low. Peace had returned. But outside, the city was not asleep. Not yet. Beyond the narrow doorway, the alleys had begun to glow. Lamps blinked to life, like stars scattered across the earth. A rhythm stirred in the distance, not hurried, not loud, but gentle, inviting. For this was no ordinary night. It was a night when time bent softly, when voices lifted in song, not sorrow, and when the moon rose, the city of yore came alive slowly, warmly, as if remembering how to dream again. Asterisk when the sun fell behind the distant hills and the earth exhaled its heat. The city did not go to sleep. It transformed. Yore so dusty and quiet by day began to shimmer, not with electricity or noise, but with the slow flicker of oil lamps lighting up one by one, tiny flames blooming in doorways, along rooftops, beside alley walls, and in that soft golden light, the city awoke in another way, quieter, and yet somehow more alive. The festival of the full moon came only once a season. It did not arrive with trumpets or parades. It crept in with song. Somewhere, a woman's voice began a melody low, like a lullaby meant for the stars. Then another joined her, and another, until the alleys breathed with harmony. Children with palms stained from tamarind dashed across the streets in bare feet, chasing the shadows of moths drawn to flame. Elderly men sat with their backs against warm clay walls, their faces lit orange by the lamps, their eyes fogged with memory. Young lovers wandered slowly, pretending not to look at each other. Along the riverbank, clay ovens had been fired since mid-morning. By nightfall, they gave off the scent of cardamom bread and roasted lentils, fig cakes, and stewed dates wrapped in leaves. Food was not sold, it was offered. One hand passed to another, without count, without cost. For one night, all were equal in the presence of the moon. It was not a night for speeches or kings. It was for those who sang softly to themselves while grinding wheat, for those who danced, not to impress, but to remember. In the temple courtyard, dancers moved in slow spirals, feet bare against the stone, wrists twisting like the wind. They wore anklets made of shell and copper, and with every step came a faint chime. The rhythm was not fast, it was not meant to be. It matched the breath of the earth, steady, low, hypnotic. At the center of the square, someone unrolled a cloth mat embroidered with symbols of the stars. Children gathered around as an old woman knelt beside it. From her pouch, she took small stones carved with ancient signs and cast them gently across the fabric. Each child leaned forward, wide-eyed, as she told them their fortunes in a whisper, too soft for the wind to steal. Not far from her, a man sat alone, painting his dreams onto a shard of pottery, not for anyone to see, just to record the shape of a feeling. He drew a fish beneath a tree, a house with no roof, a hand reaching toward a bird. Above them all, the moon glowed enormous and full, casting silver onto every edge. It illuminated the temple bricks, the river's gentle waves, the linen robes drying on a line, and in its light, nothing was grand, and nothing was small. A woman held her sleeping baby as music played from across the street. She did not sway to the rhythm. She breathed with it. The guards on the ziggurat wall leaned their backs against the stone, watching not for enemies, but for dreams. One of them began to hum an old song, something his grandmother used to sing when the air smelled of rain. And still the city moved, softly, deliberately, as if each person knew the night was sacred and would pass too quickly if rushed. A boy with clay-stained fingers dipped them into a pot of blue pigment and began to draw on the outer wall of his house. He painted stars. He painted a face with open eyes. He painted a spiral. He did not stop to explain. Elsewhere, a woman stood at the edge of the river, staring at her own reflection. The water shimmered. She bent down and touched its surface, and for a moment it felt like she was touching the sky. There were no feasts inside palaces that night. The nobles came down from their high courtyards. They walked among the people. A merchant's daughter offered figs to a servant's son, and he bowed not out of obedience, but out of wonder. And as the night deepened, as the songs slowed and lanterns began to burn low, the city curled inward like a sleeping animal. People returned to their homes, their mats, their woven covers. Some slept with others, some alone, some beneath the stars, and some did not sleep at all. They sat quietly, holding the silence like a gift, letting the cool wind trace their skin, letting their minds float gently outward into dream, into memory, into the space where the gods no longer speak, but still listen. In the final hour before dawn, the city of yore lay still. The bread ovens cooled, the songs faded, even the rivers seemed to pause, but somewhere in the sky, the moon lingered just a moment longer. watching over the city that had once offered its stories, and now offered its silence. When the sun fell behind the distant hills and the earth exhaled its heat, the city did not go to sleep. It transformed. So dusty and quiet by day began to shimmer, not with electricity or noise, but with the slow flicker of oil lamps lighting up one by one, tiny flames blooming in doorways, along rooftops, beside alley walls, and in that soft golden light, the city awoke in another way, quieter, and yet somehow more alive. The festival of the full moon came only once a season. It did not arrive with trumpets or parades. It crept in with song. Somewhere, a woman's voice began a melody low, like a lullaby meant for the stars. Then another joined her, and another, until the alleys breathed with harmony. Children, with palms stained from tamarind, dashed across the streets in bare feet, chasing the shadows of moths drawn to flame. Elderly men sat with their backs against warm clay walls, their faces lit orange by the lamps, their eyes fogged with memory. Young lovers wandered slowly, pretending not to look at each other. Along the riverbank, clay ovens had been fired since mid-morning. By nightfall, they gave off the scent of cardamom bread and roasted lentils, fig cakes, and stewed dates wrapped in leaves. Food was not sold, it was offered. One hand passed to another, without count, without cost. For one night, all were equal in the presence of the moon. It was not a night for speeches or kings. It was for those who sang softly to themselves while grinding wheat, for those who danced, not to impress, but to remember. In the temple courtyard, dancers moved in slow spirals, feet bare against the stone, wrists twisting like the wind. They wore anklets made of shell and copper, and with every step came a faint chime. The rhythm was not fast, it was not meant to be. It matched the breath of the earth's steady, low, hypnotic. At the center of the square, someone unrolled a cloth mat embroidered with symbols of the stars. Children gathered around as an old woman knelt beside it. From her pouch, she took small stones carved with ancient signs and cast them gently across the fabric. Each child leaned forward, wide-eyed, as she told them their fortunes in a whisper, too soft for the wind to steal. Not far from her, a man sat alone, painting his dreams onto a shard of pottery, not for anyone to see, just to record the shape of a feeling. He drew a fish beneath a tree, a house with no roof, a hand reaching toward a bird, and in the shadows between homes, a flute played soft, wandering. The notes drifted like perfume through the streets, curling around clay walls and slipping beneath woven curtains. It was the kind of song that seemed to have no beginning and no need for an end. In the back courtyard of a quiet home, a mother lifted her child into her arms and pointed upward. The stars shimmered above them, faint but steady. "Those are the eyes of those who came before," she said. The child did not answer, but he looked up, and something settled quietly in his heart. A group of teenagers lit a fire at the edge of the date grove. They told stories not from the past, but from their own imagined futures. One would be a sailor, another would see the king. They laughed until the fire dimmed and the wind picked up. Then they lay in the grass and watched the moon trace its arc, saying nothing at all. Somewhere in the high courtyard of the temple, a scribe had fallen asleep at his desk, his stylus still resting on the clay. The unfinished tablet beside him read only one word: wait. Farther out, beyond the city walls, shepherds tending their flocks watched the glow of yore from the hills. It looked like a bowl of gold turned upside down. They made no move to go down. They simply sat and watched, and felt less alone. A boy with clay-stained fingers dipped them into a pot of blue pigment and began to draw on the outer wall of his house. He painted stars. He painted a face with open eyes. He painted a spiral. He did not stop to explain. Elsewhere, a woman stood at the edge of the river, staring at her own reflection. The water shimmered. She bent down and touched its surface, and for a moment, it felt like she was touching the sky. There were no feasts inside palaces that night. The nobles came down from their high courtyards. They walked among the people. A merchant's daughter offered figs to a servant's son, and he bowed not out of obedience, but out of wonder. The rivers no longer roar. They do not cut the land as they once did. They murmur now soft and distant, like a lullaby from a room you no longer sleep in, somewhere far beyond the reach of city lights and satellite maps. The bones of Mesopotamia still lie buried in the earth, not the bones of kings or warriors. No monuments of marble, just broken bowls, fragments of spindle whorls, bits of obsidian shaped by a craftsman whose name has been lost to everything but wind. The cities are gone, but they are not empty. Your Lagash, arid ones, so full of breath now lie still. But in that stillness, there is memory, a different kind of life, one that no longer walks but waits. You cannot hear it with your ears, but if you lie in silence, long enough, if you let your thoughts slow, if your breath matches the rhythm of soil, you may begin to feel it. It begins like a warmth behind your ribs, a hush behind your eyes, not nostalgia, something older, the memory of place. Long ago, the people who walked these streets did not think of themselves as ancient. They were not relics, they were not history, they were now. Their worries were not philosophical, they were practical. Will the barley ripen? Will the ox birth safely? Will the god accept our offering this time? Yet they built things that still whisper our names. They didn't do it for us, and yet they did. Somewhere in the ruins of a city swallowed by dust, there is a single bead lapis lazuli, worn smooth by fingers that touched it thousands of times. It sits now in a drawer in a museum, but before that, it hung from the neck of a young girl. Perhaps she received it from her mother. Perhaps it was passed down, generation to generation. Perhaps it was lost during a market festival, slipped from its string while she danced near the temple steps, and she never saw it again. You cannot find that girl in any archive. No king's list remembers her, and yet she was real. She cried when her lamb died. She laughed when her older brother tripped in the canal. She once stood beneath the full moon and wished for something small. Her life ended long before your great-great-grandparents were born. But in the moment that bead was carved, she lived. And that moment still echoes. These cities, once so full of voice, have turned to dust, not because they failed, but because that is the way of all things. Everything erodes, everything returns, even memory, if left too long in silence, dissolves. But it is not lost on the heat that shimmers over empty ruins, in the carved stone blocks that still resist the wind, in the layout of streets now barely visible from the air. The shape of the past survives not in clarity, but in rhythm. The rhythm of the bricks, the way the sun fell across a doorway, the worn spot on a threshold where thousands of feet once passed. It is enough. Let us walk there now, not with boots or maps, but in thought. Let us walk along a ghost road, where houses once stood, their walls painted with ochre and smoke. Here, a man once carved a lion on a clay tablet, not because it mattered, but because it was beautiful. There, a woman tied her child to her hip with a length of wool and hummed a song passed down through generations. There are no armies in this place now, no priests to burn incense, no merchants calling from their stalls. Only the sky remains high and blue, the same as it was. Only the wind, which carries stories it does not understand. Beneath your feet, the earth is full of echoes, the crack of a pot being fired, the low murmur of prayer beneath the temple dome, the sleepy creak of a door. In the evening, as someone returns home from the fields, these are not dramatic memories, they are ordinary, and that is their power. They remind us that history is not only made by those who ruled, but by those who folded dough, who fetched water, who patched their sandals, who told their children stories under a flickering lamp and hoped they'd sleep through the night. Even now, the rivers remember. The Tigris and the Euphrates, once wild, now dammed and narrowed, still trace the same paths, winding like lazy serpents across the plain. The birds still follow their currents. The reeds still sway in the wind. The water still carries the silt that fed the world's first harvests. And though the names have changed, though the cities are buried and the temples crumbled into stone, the essence remains. Not in perfection, but in persistence. That is the true legacy of Mesopotamia. Not that it conquered, but that it endured. Not that it shouted, but that it sang. And now, in this final hour, as your mind drifts and your breath softens, allow this story to dissolve with you. Let the ziggurat fade into night. Let the incense cool. Let the gods return to whatever place they came from. You do not need to remember everything, only that it mattered, that they lived, that the first time someone watched the stars and wondered, they did so on this very soil, and that wonder has never left us. So now, sleep, sleep, as they did beneath open skies, with nothing but wind to guard you. Sleep beside ancient canals and fields that once bloomed with barley. Sleep in the company of people you never knew, but who walked the same world. Sleep in the ruins of time, not broken, but still breathing. And when the rivers finally sleep, when even the gods grow quiet, you will still be there, in the silence, in the dust, in the dream.